start. Welcome to tonight's class. Give it a rest. All about Shemitta, which is the year that we find ourselves in. There's a couple of people here in the shul, and then everybody else is at home. And we are also live streaming the session so that anyone who wants to catch up on YouTube can do so afterwards. We are going to jump straight in with some slides. No, that's the wrong one. But welcome to, there we go. There we go. Let's try and jump straight in with our slides and outline what we're doing this evening. Can you see my screen? Can you hear me? Everything okay in terms of audio, visual? Can you now see my first slide over there on Zoom? Anyone let me know?
Yes, we can. Yes, all good.
Okay, and can you hear okay?
All very clear.
Okay, great. Sorry. Okay, so give it a rest. Shoshana decided that she was going to send out a message to the shul with Rabbi Landau having a sabbatical. I think that would be a good clickbait for everyone to open up the email. But that was going to be the title for today, which is essentially we're all going on sabbatical. The land of Israel is having a sabbatical year because this is the year which started in Rosh Hashanah of Shemitta. Now, I was about to say, and it's been 7 years since our last one, but I think that's quite obvious. Every 7 years, there's a cycle that we have 6 years of working the land and the 7th year of resting the land. So what are we going to do today to have a little think about Shemitta? So we're going to start off by thinking about the socio-economic ramifications of Shemitta.
Sorry.
And, pardon? Okay, and for that, we're going to actually use some material from Aleph Beta. Many of you know that I like their material, and I thought actually tonight, since we're having an audiovisual presentation and we're trying to engage with Shemitta in a bigger way, so actually let's just look at the videos together in Aleph Beta. We have a subscription with the shul. There might be an issue with YouTube, with people watching it on YouTube. We'll make sure that that's not a copyright issue. But we'll look using Aleph Beta video to understand the socio-economic meaning of Shemitta. Then we're going to look at the laws of Shemitta as they apply to anyone who is in Israel. Then we're going to look at another video about the spiritual aspects of Shemitta. Finally, we'll look at some laws regards to Shemitta in the diaspora, so buying any Shemitta produce in local shops. And we'll conclude also by thinking a little bit about a principle, about loans that also go into remission in the 7th year, and have a summary of the day. So without further ado, let me use the Aleph Beta video in order to introduce in a more deep sense what is going on when it comes to Shemitta. Anyone who's on Zoom, give me a shout if the video quality isn't any good, and I'll try and manage it a bit better. I'm hoping you're seeing that I'm switching my screen over to Aleph Beta. So this is Aleph Beta. I don't know if anyone's been on it before. Anyone's got a subscription. Let me just pause for a moment. Something is not quite right. Here we go. Okay.
Welcome to Parshat Bahar. Bahar is one of the shortest parshiot. It's just one chapter long. And it's all about the seemingly strange laws of 2 different events. Shemitta and Yovel, the sabbatical year and the year of the Jubilee. These laws are so foreign to us, especially to those of us living outside the land of Israel. And think of those words, sabbatical, Jubilee. They sound so archaic. What are they about?
Let's start with Shemitta. God says, Ki tavo el haaretz asher ani noten lachem, when you come to the land, Vishavta haaretz Shabbat laHashem, the land will keep a Sabbath unto God. Okay, that's interesting. How does land keep Sabbath? Well, the next verse tells us how. 6 years you should plant your field, prune your vineyards, gather in your wheat, and in the 7th year, Sadcha lo tizra, v'charmecha lo tizmor. Don't plant your fields, and don't prune your vineyards. So, in Shemitta, you're not allowed to work the land. But don't worry. God says you won't go hungry. Just because you can't work the land doesn't mean you're not allowed to eat from what naturally grows on the land. You're allowed to eat from it along with your slave, your maidservant, your hired worker, and your settler who lives with you, not to mention the animals that are in your land as well.
Okay, so that's Shemitah. Then there's the second event, Yovel. The verse says you're supposed to count 7 Sabbaths for the land. That's 7 cycles of Shemitah, or 49 years. And on the 50th year, it's a Yovel. In the Yovel year, 3 things happen. First, it has all the laws of Shemitah. You can't work the land. Second, anyone who's a slave goes free. And third, land goes free. How does land go free? Well, say I owned some land that was my ancestral holding in Israel. I sell my land to Emu. In the Yovel year, that land, which is now Emu's, comes back to me.
So here are 2 questions. First of all, why should we care about any of this? Are these just arbitrary laws? Did God get a little Sabbath happy when writing the Torah? Last week we talked about how for 6 days you work and the 7th day you rest. So maybe 6 years you work and the 7th year you rest. And then maybe, after 7 times of resting in the 7th years, we have an extra super-de-duper rest. But are we supposed to learn anything from these laws? What do they mean to us? Secondly, Shemitah and Yovel are seemingly connected, but Shemitah has nothing to do with freedom. It's about rest. Why should land go free in Yovel? And how did slaves get mixed up in all this? Don't get us wrong, we're very happy that slaves are going free, but what do they have to do with Shemitah?
Join us as we explore Shemitah and Yovel this week on the Parsha Experiment. Hi, I'm David Block,
And I'm Imu Shalev.
and welcome to the Parsha Experiment. Now, we're not economists and we're not farmers. We're just 2 Jewish boys from Long Island. But we think we have a pretty strong theory for how to understand these laws and this whole section of the Torah. So hear us out. We want to suggest that the laws of Shemitah and Yovel are designed to solve a serious economic problem. The economies of the ancient world were all agrarian. That meant that in order to make money, you took the only asset you had, land, and you mixed it together with labor, usually the labor of a farmer, and you produced crops. You could either eat those crops, or if you have a surplus of crops, you could sell them. If you were an entrepreneur, you could take that extra money and use it to buy more land or better seed, so you could yield an even larger surplus the following season. Or maybe hire some workers, or buy some slaves so you can sit mai tais while they do the backbreaking labor of the field.
All this sounds fair to us, right? Hard work and entrepreneurship should be rewarded. More capital, more land, more money goes to the people who have the skill to provide jobs for the rest of us, to feed the rest of us. But the problem is, this isn't always true. Take Larry. Larry is a farmer who has fallen on hard times. His area of the country faced severe drought this year and he can't feed his family, let alone pay his workers. But Larry is an entrepreneur. He realizes that his land is on a great trade route and he thinks that he can turn a tremendous profit by opening up an inn. There's only one problem. He's out of money, and opening up an inn is very expensive. To open this inn, he needs capital, startup money. So Larry goes to the ancient equivalent of a bank and asks for a loan.
The bank doesn't want to take a risk on this guy. What if the inn isn't successful? So they give Larry a loan on condition that he mortgages land to the bank. If the inn goes under, the bank will just take his land. Thankfully though, Larry's business is successful, and he saves himself and his family from a life of poverty through pure ingenuity. Well, not pure ingenuity. It was ingenuity and access to capital. Larry was able to turn an idea into reality because a bank was willing to take a bet on him. And the only reason they took that bet is because Larry is a landowner.
Okay, so let's change our case a little bit. Say that Larry isn't a great entrepreneur and he doesn't think of this inn idea, but his employee, Sam, does. Larry is selling his land to make ends meet, and Sam wants to buy it and build an inn on it. The only thing is, Sam isn't a landowner. He has no capital. So when he goes to the bank, he has nothing to mortgage, so the bank won't take a chance on him. Sam has the ingenuity, but no land or capital. What does he do now? In order to provide for himself and his family, he must sell himself into slavery.
Ancient economic systems were set up in a way in which, over time, capital tended to concentrate in fewer and fewer hands. The rich got richer and the poor got poorer. Across many civilizations, you had the wealthy landowning class at the top of the pyramid, with sharecroppers and hired workers in the next and much bigger tier, with slaves, the largest class, at the bottom. And think about it. If there's no way up the pyramid, and many ways down, the wealth gap grows larger and larger. You have the many producing wealth for the few. There's an inverse relationship between slaves and land ownership. The less control you have over land, and the more alienated from land you become, the more like a slave you become. And the problem with agriculture, and with this entire economic system, is that it made it very tempting to subjugate the poor and turn them into slaves. Agriculture is really hard, and so expressing ownership, not only over the land but over other people, is very desirable. Look at slavery in the South in early American history. Or, notice how Egypt, the breadbasket of the Middle East, made its wealth on the backs of slaves.
So if these are the problems of agrarian societies, the laws in Parshat Bahar are the solutions. Shemitta and Yovel are like bookends of the ways out of poverty. When read together, they basically tell the following story. Shemitta is the year that provides some relief to the poor. The produce of the land becomes hefker, ownerless, and anyone having a hard time making ends meet can eat off the fat of the land. And if that isn't enough, the Parsha continues with some other laws for landowners who have fallen on hard times. The text tells us, Ki amuch achicha, when your brother becomes poor, umachar me'achuzato, and he has to sell his property, a family member should buy it back for him. Things have gotten so bad for this landowner that he had to sell his land. The Torah doesn't like it when you're alienated from your land. Your relatives have a responsibility to buy it back for you and help you get back on your feet.
But if you don't have a relative who can do that for you, you become landless. And that brings us to the next law in our parsha. V'chi amuch achicha, when your brother becomes even poorer, don't let him be homeless. Now that he has sold his land, let him live with you. And if he asks for a loan, lend to him, don't charge interest. But if you don't have someone who will do that for you either, God has another failsafe for that too. The next case discusses someone so poor that he needs to sell himself into slavery. V'chi amuch achicha, when your brother becomes poor, v'nimkar lach, and he is sold to you, you may not work him as a slave. Kischir kitoshav yiyeh imach. He must be treated as a hired worker. Give him a job, and let him go free in the Yovel year.
But why would letting a poor, homeless person go free in the Yovel help with anything? Remember, without capital, they still don't have a way up the economic ladder. Well, remember that in Yovel, not only did slaves go free, but land returned to their original owners. That poor and homeless person leaves the land of his master and can finally return home. He would finally have land and a new opportunity to provide for himself and for his family. That's how land and slaves are connected in Yovel, and that's how Yovel is connected to Shemitta. Shemitta, Yovel, and the economic laws in between seem to be all about avoiding slavery. They are checks and balances on the harsh agricultural economic system that ends up concentrating wealth in the few and leads to the abuse of the many.
The Torah system is neither purely capitalist nor purely socialist. Capitalism today has all kinds of checks and balances to prevent monopolies and promote competition. And the Torah is not claiming that everyone needs to own all the wealth equally. The people of Israel all began on equal footing. And after that initial distribution, the regular capitalism of an agrarian economy could take hold. That's perfectly allowed. But God was very aware of the dangers of such an economy and how those who end up without land end up perpetually stuck in a cycle of poverty, with a lack of economic opportunities and no access to capital. So, God put a check in the system. It runs as a free market for 49 years, punctuated by some relief in the Shemitah years. But in the 50th, V'shavtem ish el achuzato, v'ish al mishpachto tashuv. Everyone returns to their ancestral land, to their families. God hits the reset button. All acquired land is returned. Everyone gets a fresh start.
But how is any of this fair? I bought that land from David. I paid him very nicely for it. Why does he suddenly get to snatch it back? That hardly seems fair. Well, God addresses that directly, and in so doing, reveals the underlying reason for all of this. V'ha'aretz lo timacher litzmitut. No land can ever be sold perpetually. When you buy land, you're really just leasing it until Yovel. Why? Ki li ha'aretz. Because, God says, the land is really mine. You are just guests in it. Yes, I gave you land to use and enjoy, to prosper and become wealthy, but not at the expense of anyone else. It's mine, so I make the rules. If you want the land, you have to treat everyone equally. All get the same opportunities. That's my condition.
And now look at how God continues. Ki gerim v'toshavim atem imadi. Because you are all strangers and sojourners with me. Remember that language? God said that during Shemitta, everyone gets equal access to land. Even the settlers, the visitors, who are staying with you. You know why? Because all of you are landowners and settlers staying with me, in my land. And later, God makes it even clearer. Ki li v'nei Yisrael avadim. For all of Israel are my servants. All of your servants go free in the 50th year, because after all, you're really all my servants. The agricultural economy doesn't just create a social justice problem. It creates a spiritual problem as well. If I think the land is mine, if I think I can acquire people like property, I become distant from the Creator. Determining the fate of a piece of the earth litzmitut perpetually? That's God's domain. And controlling the fate of another human soul? That's God's domain. And just as Shabbos teaches us not to overcreate by resting one day out of every 7, Shemitta teaches us that we can create on the land, provide opportunity for our brethren, and create jobs. But we can't overcreate. In the 7th year, rest. And in the 50th year, remember that land, people, they're both in my domain. You're only stewards of the wealth I give you.
Just like Shabbos, Shemitta reminds us that despite our work and despite our ingenuity, God is our creator. And if we are all his children, we are all brothers. That's why every law in this parsha is introduced v'chiyamuch achicha, when your brother becomes poor. We are all family, and our economic production should not be a game of monopoly, where the goal is to accumulate wealth and win over others. Indeed, this parsha ties us together as a people, where no one in the family of God gets left behind.
And maybe that's why these laws are here at this point in the book of Leviticus. The last few weeks, we've been learning about Kedusha as a way to make a place in our world for others, just as God made a place in his world for us. And that's exactly what Shemitta and Yovel are about, creating space for others. The verse even says, Ki Yovel hi kodesh tiyeh lachem. Yovel is holy for you. In fact, this is actually the culmination of the Kedusha section. Why? Well, we've seen two different expressions of Kedusha. We've seen Kedusha in physical space, and then we saw Kedusha in time.
And now, look at the very last verse of our parsha, which is really the concluding verse to the whole Kedusha section. Et shabtotai tishmoru umikdashi tira'u, ani Hashem. Keep my Sabbaths and be in awe of my sanctuary, for I am God. Sabbath is the paradigmatic example of Kedusha in time. We make time for God every 7 days. Respect Mikdash, God's sanctuary. The Mishkan is the paradigmatic example of Kedusha in space. We make a space in our world for God. Perhaps holiness in time and space come together in the land of Israel through Shemitta and Yovel. Every 7 years and every 50 years, we create a time where all space is devoted to our brothers and sisters.
As the book of Vayikra winds down, we begin to take the lessons of the Mishkan, of the sanctity of God's space, and apply them to land. Because if the land is God's and we're God's children, then we're all brothers and sisters before Him. We're given the opportunity to build our lives and our careers, but we have the responsibility to take care of the rest of the family. And what could be more holy than that?
Join us for the conclusion of the book of Leviticus next week on the Parsha Experiment.
Okay, so we are back with our slideshow. Any thoughts, questions, comments on?
I have a question about the land not being a permanent ownership, because I suppose one of the blueprints for our heritage is the sale of land to Avraham Avinu. So how does that fit in?
It's leased. I suppose that's a great question. You're asking how can it be that land is given to Avraham Avinu if it's not owned by Avraham Avinu forever?
No, I don't mean. I mean Ephrata. He bought land in Ephrat.
Right.
And there are deeds for that, and there's like a whole scene that plays out and that focuses on the actual exchange of deeds and money. So we make a big hullabaloo about that, but there seems to be a bit of tension.
I'd say it's the difference between a freehold and a leasehold. That the freehold of the land is God's. That's what it means. Ki li kol haaretz. It's all mine. It's all God's. The freehold ultimately is God's, and the lease is what Abraham bought, and the lease is the Jewish people's. But that the lease runs out every 50 years, and then there's a resetting of the lease following the Jubilee year. And so probably Abraham bought the lease. Does that answer the question, Shoshana?
Enough for now, thank you.
Any other questions or thoughts, comments on the video? Was that the first time anyone's seen Aleph Beta, or has people seen it before? If you enjoyed it, you can look them up online. They've got a wealth of material.
They're really good, aren't they, Rabbi Landa? They're really, really interesting materials. They're really well set out as well.
Right.
The aspect of the land returning after 49 years, I'm not sure whether that's a good incentive or motivation for the individual who's selling the land in the first place. I don't know what the life expectancy was at that point, but if someone sells it immediately after the previous Yovel, what's the probability of they'll still be alive at the end of 49 years?
Right, I think just as property depreciates in value the closer it gets to the end of its lease, nowadays it's like under 80 years it depreciates, but certainly something with only a few years left on the lease, the property is depreciated in value. So then that is taken into account when one is purchasing in biblical times or in olden times, the amount of time left on the lease, so to speak. So I think that...
I'm not even sure, Rabbi, if it's an old...
What was that, Jeff?
Ground that you have.
One more time, Jeff.
Right back. It's a property. You really only have it for 50 years, I think, but there's some workaround that with the government. I think the land in Israel, I think this is a 50-year period. I don't know the ins and outs, and perhaps we'll find out one day. But I think that still applies. Right.
Okay. I think we're not sure when the Jubilee year falls out, so that's one of the reasons that it's become a bit of an issue, a bit more of a modern day issue, that we know when the 7-year cycle is, but the fifth, where the 50-year point is, I don't think we know so well. But let's carry on a little drop, and the way that we're going to kind of investigate the laws of Shemitta now is to have a bit of a quiz. So everything is going to be a true or false question, and I would like someone to hazard a guess before we jump in. So first question, true or false? Nowadays, Shemitta is not mandated by Torah law, but by rabbinic law. True or false?
False.
False. So we've got a suggestion. Who was that?
Werner.
False.
Okay. So the answer is it's true. It's true. Okay, so according to many authorities, keeping Shemitah nowadays is a rabbinic rather than biblical injunction. This is because the majority of the world's Jews are not living in the land of Israel. So if the majority of the world's Jews were living in the land of Israel, then we'd say it would be goy echad ba'aretz, to be one nation in the land. But because there's the majority of people, once you count up all the Jews in the world, so then more people probably combined in England, North America, France, etc., than there are in Israel, and therefore it's rabbinic rather than biblical. Now, does that have any other ramification? So it could, because what's the great danger of Shemitah? The great danger of Shemitah is that the people of Israel run out of food. However, this was counteracted by a promise made in the Torah. What's the promise made in the Torah? That there will be such a bountiful crop in the 6th year that it will be enough to carry them through not just the Shemitah year, the 7th year, but also the 8th year. Because if you think about it, if they're not planting anything in the 7th year and they're only starting to plant in the 8th year, so then the 8th year is also going to be a year which is challenged. So the Torah promises that in the 6th year there's going to be this bountiful crop, and that's going to then take them through. So that according to the Sema, now the Shemitah is only rabbinic, so the promise of bounty in the 6th year is no longer in effect. However, the Chazon Ish disagrees and thinks that the promise of bounty is still in effect. However, he still says that people should try and make arrangements to ensure that they don't come into trouble. So don't rely on the promise. Try and do as much as you can to avoid it. So far, and by the way, we're talking about Shemitah in the land of Israel. Even Shemitah in the land of Israel nowadays, we say it is derabanan. We say it is rabbinic, not d'oraita, not biblical. Okay, next question. True or false? One is not allowed to tend one's garden during the Shemitah year, right? So if there's a prohibition against sowing the land, working it, planting, pruning, so can you mow the lawn? Can you look after the trees and the flowers in your garden? True or false?
False. And it would be a disaster for me, Rabbi, if that were true.
Well, I mean, Liz, you're okay because last time I checked, your garden's in the Holy Land of Barnet rather than the Holy Land of Israel. So we are talking about Israeli land gardens. And by the way, when I talk about the land of Israel, it's also important to note that not everything within the state of Israel is considered to be biblical Israel. Can anyone know where a good example of a town which is in the state of Israel but not in biblical Israel?
Eilat.
Eilat. So that's right. So Eilat is too far south. It's in the state of Israel, but it's not in biblical Israel. So the boundaries of biblical Israel don't extend as far south as Eilat. Therefore, if you were to buy produce which was grown in Eilat or the surrounding region, like I don't know, in the Timna National Park, so then that food wouldn't have any Shemitah restrictions that we're going to learn about because it was grown as if it was grown in Liz's back garden. But let's imagine Liz's back garden is in, I don't know, Ranana, and they've got a beautiful house in Ranana. They just lifted up the house from Barnet. It flew on magic carpet, the wings of eagles over to Ranana. It set itself down, and now Liz wants to look after her garden. Can she look after it? So the answer is you are allowed to tend one's garden in a particular way. So the Torah prohibits sowing, planting, plowing, and pruning, as well as harvesting in the traditional manner. So the key parts of actually creating and then harvesting crops. The rabbis additionally prohibited the next set of sort of agricultural actions, which is fertilizing, irrigating, digging, weeding, general pruning, meaning the first pruning was of grapevines. This is general pruning, and other activities intended to prepare for or promote growth. However, and here's the big but, is just the sages permitted this latter set of activities when necessary to preserve the health and fitness of grain, trees, and plants. Therefore, one may tend one's garden in order to perform this preventative maintenance. Not to necessarily, we're not allowed to plant a new crop of rhubarb, carrots, apple trees, what have you, but we are allowed to preventatively maintain our gardens in the land of Israel.
So, Rabbi, question.
Yes.
Does it only apply to sort of crops and food-giving plants and trees, or what about flowers?
It would also apply to flowers. So you're not allowed to plant a new set of flowers in Shemitta, but you can look after the flower beds that are already there. There's one exception, which is something which is grown somewhat cut off from the ground. How do you get things cut off from the ground? Let's say they're in potted plants, or even better, there's a whole market in Israel, at least there was in Gush Katif until it was given away. But there are other hydroponic arrangements in Israel whereby the produce is grown detached from the ground and in a greenhouse. That's called matzav menutak. It's something which is detached from the ground, and that doesn't receive a Shemitta prohibition because it's not produce of the ground. It's just hydroponic. Okay, so let's say if, for example, you had a porch in your house in Ranana, and on the porch there was a little roof and you had some potted plants, those would be, you'd be permitted to do more intense activities looking after them, maybe even creating some new potted plants. Okay, true or false? During the Shemitta year, a Jew is not allowed to sow, plant, or plow on Gentile-owned land. Fun? So let's say there is, Mahmoud owns a plot of land in Ranana. Mahmoud has a field in Ranana or whatever that he's looking after. He's got the deeds to the land. Can a Jew work Mahmoud's land? True or false?
Well, is it really his land? Is a question. Or is it Hashem's land? And probably, if that's the case, then probably not.
Well, once again, probably God's got the freehold, but Mahmoud for the moment has got the leasehold because he bought it from a Jew. So the answer is true. It's true. A Jew can't perform any biblically prohibited labors during Shemitta. So that's specifically the question was asking about sowing, planting, plowing, the biblically prohibited labors of creating crops and harvesting them. And not even if a land's owned by a Jew, they can't plant, sow, or plow on Israel land, whoever owns it. However, some authorities permit the rabbinically prohibited set of labors on Gentile-owned land. Now that's going to be important when we come to think about Heter Mechira, and which is, we'll see in a few minutes. So just to bear that in mind. So Heter Mechira will just on one leg is what Rav Kook, the late Rav Kook, the previous chief rabbi of Israel before it was the state, instituted in order to support the fledgling Yishuv so that they wouldn't starve, and permitted the sale of land to non-Jews such that it would be non-Jewish owned land, and thereby on non-Jewish owned land there might be a way for Jews to work it, at least doing the rabbinically prohibited activities of preventative maintenance rather than the biblically prohibited labors of sowing, planting, and plowing. But we'll see that in a moment. Okay, next question. True or false? One is permitted to consume vegetables and grains that sprouted by themselves during the Shemitta year. Can you eat things that grow by themselves? Okay, we've got a true in the room. Any other suggestions online?
Depends.
Okay, depends. I'll take the depends. That's very, very much sitting on the fence, Shoshana.
True.
So I'm going to say start off with false. Okay, start off with false. In order to enforce the prohibition against sowing and planting, the sages prohibited the consumption of anything sown or planted in the Shemitta year. So just thinking back, what is it that is prohibited? What's initially prohibited is don't work the land. Okay, now someone breaks the law and they happen to work the land. So they're a naughty boy or a naughty girl. They work the land. But what about the food that they produce? So then the sages said, no, I'm not going to allow you to get benefit from that because if I'm creating some productive outcome that you're allowed to eat, so then it's going to encourage you to break Shemitah. So you're not allowed to do that. Now, not only that, in order to prevent false claims of incidental sprouting, oh, I didn't work the land, Rabbi. It happened all by itself. It's amazing. All these carrots just appeared of their own accord. So rather than do this, the rabbis prohibited also the consumption of specific types of plants that sprouted during the Shemitta year, even if they sprouted on their own. What type of plants? So there's a difference between perennials and, is it ennials is the other example? Hardy annuals. Annuals. So an annual plant is something that needs to be planted every year and then harvested. So like wheat is an annual, you have to plant it and then sow it and reap it every year. A perennial though is something which you plant one year and it could continue giving fruit, or many years later. That's often a fruit tree is a perennial. Etrog trees are a very extreme example where the fruit actually stays on the tree for a number of years. But the rabbis prohibited any annuals so that would also include vegetables often as an annual. So I think, right, they need to be planted every, no?
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, they're annuals.
Okay, so so vegetables and grain, some flowers as well that have to be planted anew each year, even if they sprouted by themselves during the Shemitta year, are prohibited. These are prohibited under the law called Gezerat Sefichin, which is the decree of sprouting, things that sprout, things that are annuals. So things that are annuals that sprout by themselves, one is not permitted to eat of them in the Shemitta year. So then Shoshana said, depends, but a perennial, if it sprouts by itself and hasn't been worked in the Shemitta year, so there's a fruit tree that grows, and this is where there's going to be something called Peirot Shvi'it, fruit of Shemitta. So those Peirot Shvi'it, those are able to be eaten, and they're not considered svichin. They're not considered to be under this decree against sprouting annuals because they're perennials. However, there is going to be a restriction on how we eat them. So we will get onto that in a minute.
So, Rabbi, cheeky question.
Go for it, Liz.
There are biennials as well, where you plant them one year and then you get the produce of it the following year.
Yeah. So
you could try and get around Shemitah, couldn't you?
If you planted it in the
theory.
6th year, you plant it in the 6th year, and then it's obvious. That seems well. You wouldn't be able to like work it hard in the biennials in the Shemitah year, but you would be able to pluck them. And we'll talk about how you take the produce that is permitted. So far we've said annuals not permitted. If they're Shemitah produce, perennials permitted in a particular way, and we'll see those in a moment. Okay. True or false? Produce grown on Gentile-owned land is prohibited. Did we just do that already? No, we didn't. So before that, we said we were talking about whether a Jew's allowed to work a Gentile's land. What about now? Whether produce grown on Gentile-owned land. So maybe the Gentile works the land. So is that Mahmoud works Mahmoud's garden and then wants to sell some turnips to Moshe? Mahmoud wants to sell to Moshe. So is it?
I don't think they grow turnips in Israel, my friend.
Give me a better Israeli crop.
Beetroot.
Beetroot. Do they grow beetroot in Israel, my friend?
Yeah, by the ton.
Okay, so I didn't know that either. Okay, Google it, anyone. Check out the Rebbitzin. So Mahmoud's got beetroot to sell to Moshe. Can Moshe eat it?
No, I think. Because I think it's a way of getting around Shemitah by the back door.
So it's true. It's not going around Shemitah by the back door, but it is interesting that actually Mahmoud's crops are able to be eaten. Okay, so produce grown by Gentiles on their own land is permissible. It's only produce grown on Jewish-owned land it's considered sufficient. So let's just think about why that's the case. Again, what's the prohibition on Shemitah? The prohibition on Shemitah is to work the land. Who's got that prohibition? Does Mahmoud have the prohibition or does Moshe have the prohibition? The only person who's got the prohibition is Moshe. So if I'm going to encourage Moshe to possibly tell a fib about sprouting produce, so then I'm not going to allow anyone to eat Moshe's sprouting produce that sprouted of its own accord, the annuals that sprouted of their own accord, because maybe that's going to encourage Moshe to actually work the land. But since Mahmoud has no issue, we go back to the biblical consideration, which is that the biblical consideration is it's not the produce that is problematic, it's the action which is problematic. Okay. I've got something in the chat. Okay. Those who are going to Duff will catch up on catch up. So although Gentile-owned land seems to be the ideal source then for the supply of seventh year annuals, vegetables, crops, why couldn't we now, basically Liz says we've got a workaround for Shemitta. Well, maybe we've got a great workaround. The easiest way for feeding the land, people in the land of Israel, is simply to buy all your crops from Ramallah. So even though Ramallah is in biblical land of Israel, but Gentiles are allowed to work the land, and we can buy Gentile produce. It's called Yavul Nochri, produce from a non-Jew. So maybe that should be the way around Shemitta, so that everyone can eat.
But if it's God's land, doesn't it include non-Jews as well?
It includes any part of the biblical land of Israel. The question over here was if it's God's land, does it include? It includes any part of the biblical land of Israel. So, so what's the issue? Yavul Nochri food that is bought from a Gentile will still have the sanctity of Shemitta. The food will be holy food, and we'll talk about what you have to do with holy food. But it won't be prohibited to eat it. Okay. The problem is there are some concerns about the sort of the funding, sending funding over to broader communities of non-Jews in the land of Israel. And because of the security situation in Israel, it can also be sort of tricky for mashgichim, for people who are overseeing the produce, to gain access to the crops. So there are some tricky parts about Yavul Nochri, about Gentile produced produce from Gentile owned land, but it certainly does have one way of obtaining produce in Shemitta year. Okay. True or false? Israel's chief rabbinate employs the heter mechira, the permission to sell the land, as a way of avoiding some of the Shemitta restrictions. Heter mechira, I'll say in a second. Is it just, give me a true or false on this one, anyone?
True.
True, that's correct. So let's talk about the heter mechira. So this is like some of the controversy that sits around Shemitta, is that a century ago, when Jews began to resettle the land of Israel, then known as Palestine, the settlers were in dire economic straits, and in light of the severe financial difficulties, many rabbis permitted the bulk sale of large tracts of the land of Israel to non-Jews for the Shemitta year. Without the sale, the populace would have faced an acute food shortage. This sale is known as heter mechira, the permission to sell one's land. We therefore make the land Gentile-owned land. And if you were then to get Gentiles to work the land, so then you would have the produce that we spoke about before. So produce which is produced on Gentile-owned land by Gentiles, and it's entirely permitted to eat. The heter mechira is comparable to the commonly practiced sale of chametz before Pesach. Right, so before Pesach, in order to dispose of our unwanted chametz, we create a sale such that during the course of Pesach, the chametz is owned, the whiskey is owned by the Gentile, and then after Pesach, it's brought back. So even though it was sitting, so to speak, in our garage, it was sitting in our garage, it was sitting in our cupboard, marked off. Mr. Fred Blogs, if you'd like to have the chametz that you've bought over Pesach, then please feel free to come and drink to your hearts, or eat to your heart's content. There's a similar idea here, that we sell to Mahmud our land, and as a result, so then it becomes non-Jewish owned land, and some of the Shemitta restrictions are avoided. However, it's somewhat halachically more problematic than the Pesach sale. So first of all, it's important to note that many authorities maintain the heter mechira was only an emergency provision when there really was no other option for people in the land of Israel. It was for that time, that circumstance of the fledgling Yeshuv, and therefore it's no longer applicable today. So Israel's chief rabbinate still employs the heter mechira. However, it just should be noted that this is a vigorously debated topic amongst different organizations, and both the OU of America and KLBD do not support the heter mechira. They hold that this is not a valid sale, and that the land sold to a Gentile in this manner is really still Jewish land. It's not only that some issues are the prohibition of selling tracts of the land of Israel to non-Jews, therefore rendering the sale invalid, but also a sale which is on condition to return, and he certainly doesn't mean to sell. You know, he said on Pesach we say that if the Gentile was if Joe Smith was to turn up on our door, knock on the door, and say, "Please, can I drink my whiskey?" You know, you wouldn't really mind. You'd give him the drink. No farmer is willing to say to Mahmoud at the end of the Shemitta year, if Mahmoud says, "I'd like to keep the land," no farmer is willing to maintain that sale. So you know, there's also a certain amount of artifice within the sale, which also means that it's problematic, because in that case, all the grain, vegetables, and certain flowers grown during Shemitta on those lands that have had the heter mechira, if we don't think it's a good sale, they're actually considered sefichin, that rabbinically decreed prohibited annual crop, and therefore those would be prohibited. So anyone who's going to Israel and is looking to eat food, if it's only rabbanut, then you're going to have to be and you hold like the KLPD or the OU, so you won't be able to eat in a rabbanut establishment or rabbanut hechshed stuff from Shemitta. You have to look for a different level of oversight. Similarly, produce. One of the big issues with produce that is exported is that produce that is exported is often that which has had the heter mechira, which would not be then permitted for us to eat. Okay, and we'll come to exported produce when we come to the next part of the session. Okay, true or false? Produce grown on Jewish-owned land during Shemitta, intentionally or not, has kedusha, has holiness. True or false? True. In this room we have the true. Anyone else on Zoom? Anyone think it's false?
False.
So,
I think it's false because it's not kedusha food. It's not going as korbanos.
So it's not going to go to the temple. That's right, but it is actually holy. It's Shemitta is because the Shemitta is sanctified to God. So then most things that grow during that year, intentionally or not, have inherent sanctity. These crops are known as peirot shvi'it, as the fruit of Shvi'it. So, for example, you've got an orange in Jaffa, an orange tree in Jaffa. Now, you didn't plant it, you didn't tend it, but there are oranges on the tree. They are of themselves. We are permitted to eat these oranges. There's no rabbinic prohibition on that, because we're not concerned that a person is going to lie and say, "Oh, it grew of its own accord," but really they've planted the orange tree because by the time they plant the orange tree and the oranges have been produced, it's beyond the year. So we're not worried about that. However, the fruit itself has sanctity, and we're going to learn in a couple of true or false's time what we do with holy food in order to make sure that we treat it with a proper sort of respect. You're allowed to eat this food, but you have to eat it in a particular way and dispose of any leftovers in a particular way. Okay, so true or false? Even produce grown on Gentile-owned land in the land of Israel has sanctity. So here's the question. So I sold, Mahmoud has his own field. I didn't sell the land to Mahmoud, but he's got his own field and he's worked it, and he's got some Jaffa oranges or some olives or what have you. So even that produce has sanctity, yes or no? So trick question. It depends. It's a machlokes, it's a dispute. According to the custom of the Jews in Bnei Brak under the Chazon Ish, so then they would say, yes, it does have sanctity. According to the custom of the Jews in Jerusalem, so then under Rosh Shlomo Zalman, I believe, so then it would not have sanctity. Those are two different schools of thought. Now, the OU, and I think the KLBD as well, would hold like the lenient opinion of the Jews in Jerusalem. And therefore, if there was really Yavul Nochri food, meaning food that produce, say from Ramallah, which is being brought into Israel or being exported out. And when might you find such an export? When you might have a bottle of wine, something like that, or olive oil. So if it's Yavul Nochri, if it's Gentile produce, so then it would not have sanctity, and that would mean that you don't have to relate to it with the full, all the careful restrictions that we're going to learn about in a moment that you do with other peirot shvi'it, fruit of Shemitta, which does have sanctity. Okay, and now it's a bit tricky to know what, so you should just bear that in mind. Because how do you determine whether produce has the status of the fruit of Shemitta? So let's say we've got the Jaffa oranges. How do I know whether it's from last year, from this year, next year? So as a general rule, annual plants have sanctity when harvested in the Shemitta year. So that's interesting. So for the even for the question that you asked, Liz, about a biennial, that might be interesting, because If it's, well, here it says an annual plant. I don't know what the biennial is, but the annual plant says you plant it in this year as if it's harvested in the Shemitah year, so it's got sanctity. So herbs and vegetables that we harvested this year, that's after Rosh Hashanah, so they're considered to be Shemitah produce, even though they will have grown mostly before the Shemitah year began. So if something, if you've got a crop of wheat that was growing through Rosh Hashanah and was only harvested after Rosh Hashanah, so then once it's the point of harvest which will determine whether it's got sanctity or not. So if it was harvested in the Shemitah year, it's an annual, so then it will have sanctity and you have to look after it. Furthermore, the fruit of perennial plants like the oranges and the olives and the grapes, so maybe not grapes, ignore that. The fruit of perennial plants have sanctity if they begin to form during the Shemitah year, even if the harvest occurs after the year is over. So yeah, so actually it says over here, olives, grapes, grain and legumes are considered to be Peirot Shvi'it, so fruit with sanctity of Shemitah, if they attain 1/3 of their growth during Shemitah. So if a orange tree was planted in January or in February in this year, and then the oranges attained their growth, 1/3 of their growth prior to Rosh Hashanah next year. So even if they're harvested next year, so then they will still be Shemitah produce, which is why when you look at the lists of things to be careful about, they will have dates that extend all the way through to 2023, because even produce that is planted, so produce that is planted this year, as long as it's got 1/3 of its growth in this year, even if it's only plucked and harvested next year, if it's a perennial, so then it would still be problematic all the way through it to next year, because it's still going to be Shemitah. And we don't know, when you have a particular orange in the shop, you don't know whether it was attained 1/3 of its growth in the Shemitah year or in the new year. Now, when else is this problematic? Wine. So while the vintage, probably the vintage of this year, some part of this year is not going to be a problem, like the 2021 grape wines are not going to be necessarily a problem, because the grapes achieved most of their growth before Rosh Hashanah, and therefore they are 6-year grapes. It's actually probably 2022 wine that is going to probably have Shemitah issues. So even though the 2022 grapes will only be harvested after next year's Rosh Hashanah, they'll achieve 1/3 of their growth during this year. So you should just look at the labels of bottles to determine whether it's a Heter Mechira bottle, whether it's a Otza Basin, we'll talk about that, whether it's Yavul Nachri, so whether it's Heter Mechira, in which case probably not so keen to rely on it, it's probably got a rabbinic prohibition to drink that wine. If it's a Yavul Nachri, if it's a non-Jewish owned vineyard and the grapes have come from non-Jewish workers, so then it's okay. And according to the custom in Jerusalem, it wouldn't have any prohibition, it wouldn't have any restrictions because of sanctity, because it's non-Jewish wine, not just non-Jewish wine, it is non-Jewish grapes on non-Jewish land. However, and we'll see about Otza Basin, which is the middle one, where it is permitted to drink, but it has to be treated well. Okay, next case. Fruit of Shvi'it cannot be sold. One second. The first one is fruit of Shvi'it cannot be treated as ordinary produce. True or false? Can you treat it like an ordinary produce, or does it have to be treated differently, related to differently? What do you think?
Different. It has
Okay.
kedusha.
It has kedusha, it's got sanctity. So what's the difference whether you've got produce which is holy, which got sanctity, to something which has not got sanctity? So my father said, well, it can't really have sanctity because there's no temple nowadays. We're not talking about sanctity in the terms of a sacrifice, but we're talking about sanctity in terms of it's imbued with a special status, it's imbued with the holiness of the land of Israel. So it does have that status, and produce with that sanctity cannot be wasted or treated in an undignified manner. So there are several issues to keep in mind when dealing with the fruit of Shvi'it, of Peirot Shvi'it fruit that has sanctity from Shemitah. First of all, although one may dispose of minute scraps of food that customarily remain on the dinner plate, one must collect larger quantities of leftovers from serving dishes, pots and pans, and edible odds and ends resulting from fruit prep processes, and allow them to rot on their own before discarding them. This is because you can't throw something which is holy just into the bin. It's not according to the dignity or the sanctity of the food just to throw this in the bin. So you're making a tomato salad. You've got tomatoes that are allowed to be eaten. Let's say we'll see in a second. Let's say that they've come in a permitted way. They've grown of their own accord in a way that it's acceptable, or they're ota basin. We'll see that in a second. So you've got the tomato. You're making a tomato salad, and you've got some bits of tomato left over on the tray. Maybe you've got some bits of tomato left over on people's plates. You have to collect those pieces of tomato and not just throw them, not just wipe the leftovers straight into the bin. Now, what do? You put them into a little, they call it the Shemitta pach, the Shemitta bin. And that's a little, like, nowadays we have on our countertop little bins for recycling edibles. So edibles was the wrong word there, but you know what I meant. So you also have a little bin on your countertop. You collect all the Shemitta food and you leave it in that bag to rot. And then you can discard it, because once it's rotted, it's no longer something which has, it's like the sanctity has gone away. One should just make sure to think about the following. If you had Monday's leftovers in the Shemitta pach, and then they're rotting away, and then you put Thursday's leftovers in there a few days later, so then the Thursday's leftovers, the rotting food from Monday will actually hasten the rotting of the food on Thursday, and that's going to be a problem, which means that you have to actually create separate bags for different days. Otherwise, you're going to hasten the rotting of Thursday's food, which is also not according to the dignity that Thursday's food needs. Okay, foods that are inedible, even for animals, such as peels, may be discarded in the usual fashion. And after the stuff has rotted, the leftovers are then discarded in the regular garbage. The other workaround for this is to double wrap the leftovers. So you take a bag, you put all the leftovers in them, you tie a knot, then you put all that into another bag, tie a knot, and then you can just pop that into the garbage, because it's almost like it's in its own separate container, and it can rot away in that double wrapping. So some people will allow that. When else does this become relevant? It also becomes relevant at Havdalah time. Let's say you've got Shemitta wine that has got sanctity. Now, some people have the custom at Havdalah to fill up the cup and then allow the cup to overflow, in which case I'm wasting some of the Shemitta wine. So people don't like that. People don't like you to use Shemitta wine for Havdalah. You've got to drink it all. So since fruit of Shemitta is sanctified, one must derive maximum benefit from the produce. Anything less is considered degrading. So one must consume the produce in its usual manner and not waste any of it. And you should not consume it in a non-normal way. So something which is normally cooked should not be eaten raw. Something which is normally raw should not be eaten cooked. Furthermore, one may not use sort of some Shemitta produce to be just a flavor masker. So for example, you've got Shemitta applesauce. You're not allowed to use that to mask the taste of a bitter medicine, as this would spoil the taste of the apple, and that's not according to the status, the holiness of this fruit. And similarly, also, it's not, let's say you've got a Shemitta banana, so you should only be mashing it if it's for the ordinary use, which would be for a baby, but otherwise you shouldn't be mashing Shemitta produce, because it's not the dignified way of looking after it. Okay. Whoops, I missed a question. Peirot Shvi'it can be sold without restriction. So is that true or false? No, it's false. Fruits that have sanctity can only be sold in a special dignified fashion. Okay, so here we get on to, 1 second. Not yet. So food, it has to be sold in a special dignified fashion and may not be consumed by just anyone or in any place. So here are the considerations quickly to be learning about selling of the purchase and sale of Shemitta produce. Fruit for Shemitta cannot be purchased with the intent to resell at a profit. It's only there to meet a person's needs in terms of eating, but not in terms of creating a business. One should not give Shemitta produce to a non-Jew in case they don't treat it with the right sanctity. One shouldn't purchase Shemitta produce from someone who doesn't know about the laws of Shemitta, as we're not sure that they can be trusted to treat the proceeds of the sale in accordance with their sanctity, because there's something interesting over here. If a person buys Shemitta produce, the money that they use to purchase that Shemitta produce now becomes holy also, and can therefore only be used to purchase other food, which will also become holy because it's been purchased with holy money. So, and then that food, even let's say you buy a chocolate bar, that chocolate bar now also becomes a holy chocolate bar and has to be only eaten in a particular way. So that there is sort of like a pay it forward relationship with this sanctity, and you have to be careful about that. Finally, the sanctity of the fruit of Shemitta also prohibits export of the fruit outside of the land of Israel. And so during Shemitta, for example, for the OU, most OU certified exporters will only ship 6th year inventory or Gentile grown produce of the 7th year. Some exporters will take produce from southern Israel near Eilat, because as we said, that's not part of biblical Israel. True or false? I'm going to run through this quite quickly, but I want to get into Eitzer Basin, the final question on this part, which is over here. So the first one is trespassing on your neighbor's field, orchard, or vineyard is considered legal during the Shemitta year. So it's true to a degree, because as it said in the video, that this is now a land where everything is returned, everything becomes equal. It's a great equalizer, which includes also being able to go and take food from someone else's, crop, because it's not theirs, it's ownerless. And so theoretically, you should be able to walk into any field and eat the food. There are certain concerns that landowners might have in terms of just protecting their property, and therefore they don't necessarily have to leave their gates open. But if you were to walk down the road in Israel and you wanted to pull an apple off a tree, you'd be within your rights to do so. The Midrash apparently considers the landowner's silent endurance of the legal trespass as an act of self-control, which is of angelic proportions. When entering a neighbor's field during the Shemitta year, is it true or false that one may claim as much produce as he wants? What do you think? You can go, if everything's ownerless, can you just go and take an absolute barrel full of Jaffa oranges? True or false? What do you think?
You can only take as much as you can need.
That's right. So you only take as much as you need. And this is the concept. Now, what happened is that they had to make sure that that was really happening back in the day. So because people were taking more than they need, eyes is bigger than your stomach. And also I think the word free seems to do amazing things to people. It's like when there's free food, you overeat more than you'd ever eat. You go to a buffet, you carry on. Anyway, so the point is that the sages had to look after this. So at first they appointed guards at the city's gates who inspected the harvesters and confiscated any produce which seemed excessive. Eventually, the sages decided to empower the local rabbinical courts to hire workers to harvest the crops on their own and then distribute them as needed among the townsfolk. So then they got people who were creating a collection based on the court's mandate. It's called the Otsar Beis Din, the collection of the Beis Din, to make a stockpile of the ownerless fruit and then distribute it according to each person according to the ration or according to the needs that they have. Okay, so that's the origins of Otsar Beis Din. It's an ancient practice going back to the Tosefta, meaning going back to Mishnaic times. And the final question on this one is this Otsar Beis Din concept obsolete? And it's not. Quite on the contrary, it's becoming increasingly popular, not necessarily as a workaround for Shemitta, but a way to manage Shemitta that doesn't rely on selling to Mahmud or others, but rather enables there to be a non-profitable distribution of produce within Jewish communities. So it's undergone some this concept of the Otsar Beis Din, the collection organized by the court form of ownerless produce, is undergone some transformation and modernization in order to keep up with the times. Okay, and so here's and it's been adapted to secure the livelihood of Shemitta observant farmers and proprietors. And so here's the shtick. It's not a shtick, but here's the shtick. So instead, back in the day, the courts used to hire special officers to manage the collection and distribution. But then in current day Israel, the Jewish courts thought who better to employ to manage the harvesting and distribution of this produce that wasn't planted this year, but it grew this year. So who better to, it grew because it's a perennial or what have you. So who better to manage that distribution than the farmers themselves? Meaning the person who, I own a grove of Jaffa oranges and they're producing oranges this year. And those oranges are ownerless, but we know that people might take more than they can, they're allowed to. So what do? Well, I will take the owner of the field and appoint him as an agent of the court to harvest the oranges and then to create a distribution structure that is equitable and easy. So that's what they did. And now the court, the person who is, I'm allowed to charge just for my expenses and then pass those along as the purchase price of the orange. So I'm not profiting from the orange per se. The orange is still valueless. All I'm doing is charging for my labor. So normally, if you're to think about what constitutes the cost of an orange in the shop, you're paying for two things. You're paying for the material value of the orange, and you're also paying for the labor that went into the orange to bring it from the tree, let's say in Jaffa or in Spain or whatever, to bring it from there to you. Now in the Otza based in produce, none of the value of that orange is being provided by the actual material orange itself, but rather the purchase price is only from the labor that went into it. So it's cheaper than normal, but it's not free because you're paying for the officer's labor, and that officer happens to be the owner of the field. So this is one way to keep farmers afloat in Shemitta. The thing is, what do you think? Is this fruit going to have sanctity or not sanctity? It does have sanctity, absolutely. So therefore, if the fruit has sanctity, so then any otza based in produce is going to need to be looked after in the way that we described before, not to be thrown away into the garbage, managing the leftovers and what have you. Okay. Next. Final sort of complication, I think, of Shemitta before we conclude this part is true or false. During the Shemitta year, households must engage in biur, meaning getting rid of something, a process similar to the purging of chametz before Pesach. True or false? That's true. That's correct. That the Torah states that one may store the fruit of Shemitta only as long as that product is still available in the fields for animals to eat. That's a verse in the Torah. So once a particular species is no longer available in the field, one must rid their house of it, leaving only one day's rations for his household. This process is called biur and is similar to the well-known practice of purging one's house from chametz before Pesach, also called biur chametz. Here it's called biur of that Shemitta produce. So biur is a way of ensuring that field owners do not hoard all the produce for themselves. By forcing them to share their stock with others, once a particular item is no longer available in the field. If one does not perform biur at the appropriate time, the produce becomes prohibited to all. So, you could imagine that the Jaffa orange field owner might want to keep his oranges in a storehouse, and because even beyond the time that they're available in the field, in order to continue selling them further on down the line. But that's not going to be the way that's not the point of Shemitta. The point of Shemitta is to make it accessible to all, and therefore in order to avoid that storing of the produce, as soon as it's no longer available in the field, it has to be gotten rid of. And the procedure is simple. You take the food out, that particular, let's say it's now, Jaffa oranges are no longer available in the fields. If you've got some in home, on the appointed day, one must remove all the relevant produce and all products containing such produce, so like orange juice, from their home and take it to a public area, such as the pavement outside their home. Once there, the individual declares the produce ownerless in front of 3 people who do not live with that person. The person then waits to give the witnesses a chance to claim the produce for themselves. Once they've taken what they want, so the original owner is permitted to reclaim from the ownerless produce whatever remains, and then to eat it. It's permissible for one to choose 3 people who he knows will not really claim the produce for themselves, even though they're legally entitled to do so. Okay. There are a set of dates that come up letting you know when biur is applicable, and there are charts that list these dates, and we'll talk about those at the end, where to get hold of these things. So the laws of biur apply to all produce invested with Shemitta sanctity. They don't apply to the Gentile produce or Gentile produce from Gentile lands. Now, the final thing to consider is that oats are based in that produce which is created according to the collection of the courts doesn't need a biur, because the whole point of the Otzar Basin is to distribute the produce to the community. So since it's already in a process of distribution, there's no need to like have a safeguard in place lest someone's going to store it up, because no, it's already under the distribution process. So if you bought Otzar Basin produce, if you bought produce from that collection, paying just for the labor, and then biur comes along, and then the time to get rid of it comes along, then you have to get rid of it. But if after that date you want to buy some more of that produce that happens to be still being distributed by the court collection and distribution, that's okay, and you can carry on. Okay, final question before we segue into the new part of the presentation. Whoops, no, I didn't even have it there, which was what about Shemitta outside of the land of Israel? So that will, I think, move us across. So produce grown in the land of Israel during the Shemitta year retains its Shemitta status even if exported, whether that was done with permission or not with permission. If it's Shemitta produce, it's holy and it will retain that status, or it might not be able to be eaten because it's got the decree of Safich in the decree against an annual crop. So Jews in the diaspora should not purchase Israeli produce that does not have a reliable kashrut certification. Why? Because I don't know whether it came from a prohibited method of harvesting the land, in which case I'm not allowed to eat it, or it came from a permitted method of harvesting the land, in which case either it's Gentile produce, in which case I can eat it without any concern for its sanctity, or it's court collected produce, in which case I can eat it, but I have to be careful about how I look after it. So you will find that a number
Can I
of...
just ask a question on that one?
Yeah.
If we have, and there is, so for example, most sweet potatoes that we buy in the stores are from Israel.
Okay.
A lot of them are from Israel.
Right.
That being the case, if we say, okay, we ain't going to eat any sweet potato anymore until next year, the potential is that the Jews who rightly or wrongly had this crop shipped over are going to lose out. So are we going to buy regular potatoes, which say grow in this country, or would we buy the sweet potato to keep the Jew in business?
Okay, so I'll give a number of answers to that. The first thing is, thanks for asking the difficult questions, Dad. That's amazing. But the first point is that for sure, whenever there is a rabbi standing up saying be careful about buying Israeli produce, it just sounds horrendous, right? It's just like, come on, man. You know, we're trying to look after our brothers and sisters in the land of Israel, not give them not hurt them. And so, for example, you know, when it comes to buying produce, that you just have to be careful about its sanctity. For example, it's Otzar based in, it's collecting through the courts and a legal system that allows us to eat it. It's kosher food. So then, for sure, it's better to buy kosher food that supports people in the land of Israel, even if it's inconvenient to have to care about the leftovers, rather than not buying Israeli food. The same thing goes, by the way, when buying any Israeli produce, because we have to take tithes of Israeli produce. You can't just eat it straight up. You have to take tithes. It's a bit inconvenient. And I remember some people saying, look, it's a bit complicated, these laws, don't buy Israeli produce. But I don't think that's the message. I think the message is educate people how to process this, how to look after Israeli produce, in order to then make sure that you can support brothers and sisters in the land of Israel. If I was just to take your point a little bit differently, let's imagine there's a non-kosher restaurant down the road in Barnet. Let's say there's a kosher restaurant opening up very soon. We're very excited. Baladi's opening up. Pardon? Baladi's opening up. But let's say there's a non-kosher restaurant down the road. Let's call it I don't know, we'll call it tachina. And it's called tachina. There's a couple of Israelis. They've opened up a non-kosher restaurant. They happen to serve. I mean, maybe all the ingredients happen to be okay. Maybe they don't know. It's not really clear. Maybe there's some non-kosher food there as well. Would you tell me to go and buy non-kosher food from tachina run by the local Israeli couple because I want to support Jews? I'm sure you'd say no, because I don't want to buy non-kosher food. I'm not like, I don't have to support every activity that my brother does if it's an activity which is selling non-kosher out into the world. So the same thing goes with a farmer that has choices. Everyone has a choice, right? You have a choice. Do you create the opportunity to for your food to be kosher, or do you make it prohibited to be eaten? And if you make it prohibited to be eaten, so then I don't necessarily have to support your enterprise, just as I don't have to support the enterprise of Tachina, the random restaurant down the road by the Israelis who didn't decide to make it sure it was a kosher restaurant. You should also know that those farmers that do decide to observe Shemitta, there's a great charity which you can donate to called, I think it's called Karen Shavias, which I know and people in our community have already donated to. You can donate to farmers to help them through this year. And so if you want to be concerned about the farmers that are keeping Shemitta, that are trying to make sure there's kosher food going out into the land of Israel and into the diaspora, so rather than buying non-kosher food from others, buy kosher food from them and also send them some money through that charity.
Does the government provide any help during the Shemitah year?
That's a great question. I don't know, Shana. I wanted to actually share with you one more video, but I think we're running over time, which is amazing. So I was just going to say that Shemitta, has the way that Shemitta is introduced in the Torah is a dramatically weird way of being introduced. It says in the Torah in Parashat Bahar that the laws of Shemitta are given Bahar Sinai on the mountain of Mount Sinai. And the question that Rashi asks is a famous language, Ma inyan Shemitta Eitzel HaSinai. What does Shemitta, the laws of the seventh year, have to do with Mount Sinai? Another way of saying that is, what does this have to do with the price of tea in China? Right? What on earth does Shemitta, why did you say it was given on the Mount Sinai? I don't understand what it has to do with Mount Sinai. It's a law. It's just, there are lots of laws. I mean, all the laws were given on Mount Sinai, but why specifically you're separating out Shemitta as the law for Mount Sinai? And so it seems that, if you were to look at it on a deeper level, Shemitta somehow holds within it, conceptually, all aspects of the laws of Mount Sinai. So why is that? We thought this was some sort of like agrarian socioeconomic redistribution of wealth. How does it have within it all the laws of Mount Sinai? So an answer that is given, and I'll say it just very quickly before we move on to the final part of the presentation, an answer that is given is that normally we think about special spaces in time and special spaces in physical location. We talk about Shabbat, for example, as being a sanctuary in time. We talk about the temple as being a sanctuary in space. And what are those two things? Those are two things, two different ideas of how you create space in a physical existence for the divine. How you bring spirituality into mundane time by creating a space in your week. The seventh day of the week is now designated as more special time, godly time, spiritual time. How do you make spaces important? Well, you make little spaces within your community for shuls, for temples, etc., etc. Even in your home, you make spaces in your home for those different parts of your faith. You make space for spirituality, for Hashem, for Torah. Both of those are creating space for Hashem to come into our world. What brings together a sanctification of space and a sanctification of time? It's that thing called Shemitta, whereby the land of Israel, in the time of the seventh year, in the sabbatical year, come together. The land and the year come together, that space-time becomes godly. And that's why possibly Shemitta is this container of all the principles of the Torah, where space-time comes together to make space for Hashem. Okay, so finally, true or false, Shemitta is relevant only to those who live or visit Eretz Israel. We know that's not true. We've already sort of spoken about that. if there are things that you're not sure whether it is coming from a kosher source in the land of Israel or a non-kosher source, so then that's where you should follow KLBD and other guidance when in doubt to leave it out. However, if you know that it's coming from an acceptable permitted source, for example, it's from an Otsar Beis Din, it's from a court process of distributing food that happens to have been exported, or it's wine, for example, that has sanctity for Shemitta, we now know how to look after it. We now know that if it's got sanctity, this is what you do. You look after it, you drink it in the ordinary way, or you consume it in the normal way, you dispose of it so that it rots or that it doesn't mix up with other things. You could double bag it, and we now have been educated how to do that. Any questions on this particular thing, this particular part, what we do here with Shemitta produce? The other thing to say about Shemitta produce, by the way, is that there's also a requirement for biur, for getting rid of it. So if a person has bought Otsar Beis Din oranges and the time for biur, getting rid of them, occurs, so then you also have to take them out into the streets of Barnet or whatever, bring them to shul, stand in front of 3 other Jews, say these are now ownerless, whoever wants them can take them. If they want them, they can take them, and if you want them, you can take them back. You have to do that here as well. That's something else to bear in mind.
So one thing I'm not clear is if you go into Tesco and you see something, a food that says, a produce of Israel, how am I supposed to know where it's from, who it's from, and how to manage it?
The answer is you don't know where it's from. Therefore, if you go onto the KLBD website, where's my resources? If you go onto kosher.org.uk/Shemitta, over there on resources, you'll find a list of dates and Shemitta dates, during which during the window of time within which you expect that crop to be producing Shemitta produce and to be exporting Shemitta produce. So that's sort of the window of time whereby from the beginning to the end. So if we could look on that now together.
So if I'm standing in Sainsbury's and there are avocados that come from Israel, I pull out my smartphone and I go onto the KLBD shop site, and I literally standing there in front of avocados, look up whether I can eat them or not.
So one second, if you have the smartphone, then what are you doing? Only the rabbi doesn't have a smartphone. You need to check. So let's just work this one through. I hope you can see my screen. My computer seems to be going quite slow at the moment. Can everyone still hear me and see me?
We're not getting a screen share.
You're not getting a screen share? Okay. So
we are now.
Oh, well, now you're not, because I stopped it. So here you go. So you go onto the kosher website, kosher.org.uk Shemitta. So that's the KLBD website, and you click here for a list of fruits and vegetable Shemitta dates. So you click on that, and then comes here the list produced by KLBD. And so let's say you want to buy an avocado. There you go, Shoshana, you're standing in Sainsbury's, you want to buy an avocado. So if it says it's produce in the land of Israel, between the middle of July 2022 and the end of July 2023, you don't know whether that avocado is coming from a prohibited crop or a permitted crop, simply because Tesco's isn't going to be labeling it. Therefore, you should not buy produce during that time. Okay. However, if you were to go to a kosher store or a kosher green grocers, and they would then have a hechsher on the avocado saying it came from the Otsar Beis Din, or it was Yavul Nachri, or it was from a Gentile-owned crop. So if it was Otsar Beis Din, you would eat the avocado. If there was any leftovers of the flesh, you would leave it to rot or double bag it. If there was peel or the pit, those two things are not edible. Those can be chucked straight in the bin. If it was Gentile produce, then you'd be able to eat it normally and not have to worry about any leftovers being put away in a dignified way, because it wouldn't have sanctity. So that is what you would do with Sainsbury's and Tesco's, is you'd have to look at this list, and then because we're not sure whether things have been exported appropriately or not, we can't eat it. Okay. So I think we're coming through to the end of the session now. The other resource I wanted to share with you, hoping that you can still see my final slides over here. The other resource I wanted to share with you is the oukosher.org website, which is really useful and has all the things that we spoke. And thank you to them for comprising putting together such a resource. I also wanted to talk briefly about remission of loans, which is that in Shemitta, all loans are broken and may not be collected afterwards. So many opinions hold that this mitzvah applies today. So if anyone has a loan, then they will need to write a prosbul out before next year's Rosh Hashanah. There'll be a reminder going through in the emails near at the time. If they want to maintain their loans rather than them being cancelled, they can transfer their loan through to the court, to the Beis Din, and by doing so, the loan stays in effect. Okay. So finally, what did we do today? We talked about the socioeconomic background of Israel to through the Aleph Beta video. We talked about Shemitta in Israel, in the diaspora. We talked about some of the spiritual ideas of Shemitta, that it somehow contains in its nexus of space-time all the different laws of the Torah. And in summary, this is really an opportunity. It's an opportunity to regain maybe a lost connection to the land of Israel, to know what it is, the privilege it is, but also the responsibility to be people who live and who work that holy, holy land, that God is the freeholder, we are merely leaseholders, and what a wonderful land it is. Please God, we should all have the opportunity to travel and fruit and to drink of its holy wine. Thank you very much, everyone. If there are any questions, please do ask them now. I'll stop my share.
One quick question. What about frozen food?
That's a great question. So I think I have a note here. Yeah, I think I have a note here. 1 second. Does it not apply to frozen food? It said something, that's right, it says something on the KLBD website about frozen foods. Let me have a quick look. Because it's going to be, it said on the KLBD, yeah. Just give me 1 second, Mum. It said, please note the dates given are fresh produce and do not include frozen, tinned, or dry produce. These have a long shelf life and require a hechsher. They're going to have a hechsher because we don't know whether it was frozen from Shemitta produce and then it's not kosher. So frozen produce on the land of Israel, so it will need a hechsher.
Great, thank you very much.
Okay. Good night, everyone. Thank you very much for logging in. Lovely to see you.
Thanks, Rabbi.